I was locking my gate when Camille Whitmore stopped in the middle of the road, looked at my old house, and laughed out loud. She said Briar Glen could not let a man like me decide anything for a community worth tens of millions of dollars. Then she pointed past my fence at the transformer bank and announced the association would be taking control of it whether I liked it or not. I did not argue with her. I asked her one question instead. Had she ever actually read the power agreement that fed all 222 of her homes? 3 days later, every window in Briar Glen went dark. If you enjoy stories where an association underestimates the wrong man and walks itself straight into trouble, subscribe to the channel and stay for the ending. The white SUV pulled up at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday in early April, and I heard it before I saw it because the gravel on my access road has a particular sound under expensive tires. I was closing the swing gate after hauling a spool of shielded cable up from the shop, my hands black with grease, my shirt sleeves rolled past the elbow. Camille Whitmore stepped out of the driver's side in cream slacks and sunglasses that cost more than my truck's transmission, and 2 board members climbed out behind her with clipboards held against their chests like shields. A 4th man came last, a surveyor in a reflective vest, already looking at my tree line the way a butcher looks at a side of beef. Nobody said good morning. Camille walked to the edge of my drive, planted her feet, and started talking as if she had been assigned the job of informing me about my own land. She said the association had approved a widening of the western landscape corridor, a replacement of the fence line, a new service gate for maintenance vehicles, and new access control around the transformer enclosure, and she used the word approved after every single one of them. I set down the cable spool, wiped my hands on a rag, and asked the only question that mattered. On whose land? Camille tilted her head at me like I had told a joke in a language she almost recognized. She explained slowly, in the voice people use with children and with employees they intend to replace, that this parcel serves Briar Glen and that anything serving Briar Glen naturally falls within the association's authority to manage. I told her that was not how ownership works, that my property line sat 40 feet behind her heels, and that everything past this gate belonged to me and to a company registered in my name. She looked at my house then. She let her eyes travel across the sagging porch rail my father never fixed, the 20-year-old pickup with the primer patch on the fender, the work boots I had cracked open at the toe. Then she asked me whether I truly understood how a homeowners association operates. She asked it the way you might ask a stranger whether he can read. One of the board members shifted her weight and looked at the gravel. The surveyor kept setting up his tripod because to him I was scenery. I answered her plainly. I told her I understood how a recorded deed operates. Camille smiled the smallest possible amount and said that deeds and neighborhoods were 2 different conversations, and that she had been elected by families who expected results, and that people who chose to live at the edge of a place like Briar Glen tended to misunderstand what that edge actually meant. I watched the SUV back down my access road, and I turned and looked at the fenced pad 40 yards behind me, at the 3 tanks sitting on their concrete pour, at the 13.2 kilovolt buswork and the switch handles my father had painted safety yellow the year I graduated high school. I thought about how many hours I had spent on that pad in the rain with a torque wrench and a thermal camera. I thought about the humming I could hear from my kitchen window on hot nights, the sound of current moving toward houses I had never been inside. And I had exactly one thought, standing there with grease still under my fingernails. That was interesting, because at that particular moment 222 homes were depending on exactly that. To understand why Camille Whitmore was standing in front of my gate making promises she had no power to keep, you have to go back 14 years, to a summer when Briar Glen Estates was still red clay and survey stakes and a billboard with a golden retriever on it. The original developer was a firm called Redwood Crest Development, and they had built 2 phases without much trouble, big lots, brick fronts, a clubhouse with a fountain. Phase 3 was where the arithmetic broke. The nearest public feeder had no capacity left for another 80-some homes at the load numbers the utility was projecting, and building a new feeder run out from the substation meant crossing 3 parcels, a creek with a protected buffer, and a county road that would have required a bore permit and a full year of review. Redwood Crest had already sold lots on paper. They needed power, and they needed it before the winter draw. My father, Leon Vance, owned 11 acres just west of the property line, and on those 11 acres sat something nobody in a suit ever expected to matter. He had spent his working life as a substation technician and had bought the land in the late 1970s because it came with an old machine shop, 2 irrigation pump houses, and a medium-voltage service that had once fed a lumber operation. Over 20 years he rebuilt that service into something better than it had ever been, A proper transformer bank with modern protection, oil-filled units he tested himself, a fenced pad, a grounding grid he installed by hand over one long August. He did it because he liked doing it right and because he never fully trusted anyone else to keep his water pumps running. He was not building leverage, he was building a system. Redwood Crest came to him with an offer, and my father, who was nobody's fool, took the offer to a lawyer before he took it to dinner. The deal that came out the other side was simple and unusually careful. The developer would pay to upgrade the transformer bank, add capacity, install metering and sectionalizing equipment, and bring everything up to the utility's interconnection standard. In exchange, the developer got the right to transmit power through the Vance infrastructure into the Phase 3 distribution loop, a maintenance fee paid on a fixed schedule, and limited access rights for inspection with advance notice. The term was 10 years with renewal by written agreement. And on the last page, in language my father made them insert twice because the first version was sloppy, the document stated that all transformer equipment and the land beneath it remained the property of the Vance family entity, and that nothing in the agreement created or implied any easement, permanent or otherwise. My father died 6 years later in February in his chair with a technical manual open on his knee. I was 39 and working field jobs across 3 states, and I came home for the funeral and then never really left. Everything came to me, the 11 acres, the shop, the house, the entity, the bank, and the contract. I put the entity in order, renamed it Vance Electrical Infrastructure, and kept the system in better condition than it needed to be, partly out of habit and partly because it was the last long conversation my father and I were still having. I built my own small business out of the shop, industrial and commercial electrical maintenance. 4 employees at the busiest, mostly warehouses and cold storage in 1 hospital annex. I did not talk about the transformer bank because there was nothing to talk about. It ran. Meanwhile, Redwood Crest finished the last houses, sold the last lots, handed the common areas over to a newly formed homeowners association, and dissolved the project entity the way developers do, quietly, with a filing. The association inherited the streets, the clubhouse, the fountain, the entry gates, and the reserve study. What the association did not inherit, because the developer never owned it and could not have transferred it, was the transformer bank. But the association did inherit the paperwork, and for 8 years the paperwork was enough. A management company paid my invoices on time. A renewal was signed. Another renewal was signed. I met exactly 1 board president in that whole stretch, a retired dentist who came by once with a bottle of bourbon and asked intelligent questions about oil sampling. Then 2 years ago the management company was replaced, and last spring Camille Whitmore was elected president of the Briar Glen Estates Homeowners Association on a platform of raising property values, and about 6 months before she ever stood at my gate, the payment simply stopped arriving. Camille ran on the promise that Briar Glen had let itself go, and she was very good at making people feel embarrassed about things they had never noticed before. She was 44, she had money from somewhere that was never quite explained. She dressed for a boardroom in a neighborhood full of golf shirts, and she had a talent for saying "we" in a way that made the listener want to be included in it. Within 4 months of her election, the entry signs were replaced with limestone monuments, the wooden gate arms became wrought iron, the front island was torn out and replanted with ornamental grasses that cost $11,000, and the architectural standards document went from 6 pages to 31. There were new rules about mailbox posts, about garage door color, about the maximum height of basketball goals, about how long a boat could sit in a driveway. Fines went up. A compliance coordinator was hired part-time. The first letter came in June on association letterhead, and it politely requested that I repaint the shop building, relocate the pickup truck to a screened area, replace the field fence along the road with something more consistent with community standards, and trim or remove 3 cedar trees that were described as visually disruptive. It closed by noting that compliance with Briar Glen's architectural standards helped protect everyone's investment. I read it twice, mostly out of curiosity about the tone, and I answered with a single line on my own letterhead. My property is not part of Briar Glen Estates. I signed it, mailed it certified, and went back to work. Then, in the first week of March, I got a letter that was different from all the others, and I read it standing at my mailbox in the cold with my breath fogging the page. It informed me that the association had determined the transformer facility to be common infrastructure belonging to Briar Glen. The document was titled Infrastructure Control Notice, and it ran 4 pages with 2 exhibits, and somebody had paid real money to make it look like law. Its central argument, stripped of the decoration, was that because the transformer bank had served Briar Glen continuously since the completion of Phase 3, and because the association had made maintenance payments over that period, and because the equipment was essential to the health and safety of residents, The association had established a controlling interest in the facility and was now assuming operational authority over it. It attached a map with a hand-drawn boundary that swallowed my equipment yard and about 1.5 acres of my land. It was in a real sense a piece of fiction with a case number. Grant has done my land and contract work for 9 years, and he is a slow talker who reads fast. He came out on a Friday, sat at my table with the whole file, the original agreement, both renewals, the interconnection paperwork, 14 years of invoices, the deed, the parcel map, the survey my father commissioned in 1988. He read the infrastructure control notice last, and about a page in he made a sound I had never heard him make, and then he laughed, an actual laugh, and apologized for it. He said he had been practicing a long time and had never seen an association try to acquire a substation by memo. Then he walked me through it, and it was worse for Camille than I had understood. Nothing in the agreement, in either renewal or in any recorded instrument, granted the association any ownership interest, any easement, or any right of control. The prescriptive theory was dead on arrival because permissive use under a written contract cannot ripen into a right against the owner, and every payment the association had ever made was documented proof that its use was permissive. The maintenance fees they were citing as evidence of ownership were, in fact, the strongest evidence available that they had been renting, and the language my father had made them insert twice said in plain words that Vance Electrical Infrastructure retained ownership of all transformer equipment and the associated land. Grant then turned to the second page of the most recent renewal and asked me if I had noticed the date. I had. The current service agreement had expired 2 months earlier, in January. The association had not signed a renewal, had not responded to the 2 letters my office sent in the fall proposing one, and had not paid the invoices for December, January, or February. What was keeping power flowing through my equipment into that neighborhood was a holdover provision, a 30-day-at-a-time continuation clause, terminable by either party with written notice under the contract's own terms. Grant put his pen down and said that Camille Whitmore had sent a letter demanding I hand over the keys to a facility or association's right to use was at that moment hanging by a clause she evidently had not read. 2 days later, a motion alert woke my phone at 7:40 in the morning, and the camera showed a white contractor's truck parked across my access road with a post driver on the trailer behind it. There were 2 men, and by the time I got my boots on and out the door, they had a bolt cutter against my gate chain. I am not a large man and I do not raise my voice, and I have found over the years that walking directly at somebody at a steady pace accomplishes more than shouting. I told them to stop. The older one straightened up and said they had a work order for a fence installation and access to an equipment pad, and he held up a printed sheet with the association's logo on it. I told him the work order was for private property, that he was 90 seconds from a trespass complaint, and that if he cut my chain I would have his license number and his company name in a filing before lunch. He looked at the paper, then at the chain, then at the house, and he put the cutter down. He said, and I remember this exactly, that he had asked twice whether the association had the right and had been told to stop asking. The white SUV arrived 4 minutes later. Camille came up the road fast and got out already talking, and she did not look at me at first. She looked at the men and asked why nothing had been started. Then she turned. She said the association had a duty to inspect critical infrastructure, that residents were exposed to risk from equipment nobody had eyes on, and that I was actively obstructing a safety function. I asked her one question, the same question, in as flat a voice as I own. Did she have a court order or a recorded easement or any instrument at all granting her association a right of entry? She said the notice had been served. I said a notice is a piece of paper you wrote. She said her counsel disagreed. I said then her counsel could file something, and until then she was standing on my land. That is when she lost the thread, and it happened in front of 2 contractors and a board member who had ridden along in the passenger seat. Camille said that she had watched men like me do this before, that finally having one thing somebody needed had gone to my head, that I was enjoying the attention because attention like this did not come often to people in my position, and that it was frankly a little sad. She did not use a single word I could have printed as a slur. She did not have to. Every person in that yard understood precisely what she had said, and the older contractor turned and looked out at the road, and the board member in the passenger seat put her hand over her mouth. Deputy Nolan Price arrived 20 minutes after she called, a heavy-set man with a patient face, and he took everyone's version separately before deciding anything. He read my deed, my recorded parcel map, the survey, the tax statement, and the expired agreement at the hood of his cruiser for 11 minutes without a word. Then he closed the folder and walked over to Camille, and he was polite about it, which somehow made it worse for her. He told her that Vance was the record owner of the parcel and of the equipment on it, that nothing she had shown him created any right of access, and that the person who needed to leave was her. Camille said there had to be a process. He agreed, and said the process was a courthouse and that it did not run through a bolt cutter. The contractors were already loading the compressor. The board member had gotten out of the SUV and was standing apart, reading the copy of the agreement I had handed her, and she did not look up. Camille's face went a deep red from the collar up, and she gathered herself with real effort, and she got as far as the driver's door before she turned around and delivered her last word. She told me she would personally make certain the association never paid me another cent. She said it loudly enough for the deputy to hear, which was careless, because Deputy Price wrote it down. I stood at my gate with my hands in my pockets and gave her the only honest response I had. I told her that might be the most expensive decision she would ever make. She got in the SUV and left, and the older contractor lingered a second and told me he was sorry, and I told him he was the only one there who had done nothing wrong. That evening I called Grant and told him to date the letter. What Grant sent was not a threat, it was an accounting, and it went out certified with a return receipt and a copy to the association's counsel and a courtesy copy to the utility. It recited the facts in order. The service agreement had expired on the 9th of January. The association had failed to execute either of the 2 renewal proposals delivered in October and November. 3 monthly maintenance invoices were outstanding, totaling a sum the letter stated to the dollar. The association had asserted a false ownership claim in a written notice. The association had directed contractors to breach a locked gate on private property, an act documented by video and by a sheriff's response. Accordingly, the holdover continuation of use would terminate at the end of the notice period specified in the contract's own termination clause, 30 days, on a date the letter named plainly at the top and again at the bottom. There is one thing I need to be very clear about, because it is the part everybody gets wrong when they hear this story. I did not cut anyone's power. I could not have, and I would not have. There are 222 homes on the other side of my tree line with refrigerators and medical equipment and people who need a working furnace in March, and there is no world in which a licensed engineer walks out to a 13.2 kilovolt bus and throws a switch out of spite. That is not just illegal, it is the kind of thing that gets somebody killed, and it would have made me exactly what Camille had already told the neighborhood I was. Naomi Pierce is the utility engineer who handles the district, and she called me the day after the notice landed, and then she called the association. I know what she told them because she told me afterward, and because Judith Carver was in the room. She laid out 2 options, and there were only 2. Briar Glen could execute a new agreement with Vance Electrical Infrastructure and keep its existing supply path, or Briar Glen could fund an independent service, which meant a new feeder extension from the substation, and that meant county and state permits, a creek crossing under a protected buffer, roughly 2 miles of trenching or overhead construction, a new switchgear installation, and a feeder upgrade the utility would require the association to pay for as the requesting party. Camille refused option 1 flatly in the meeting on the record. She said the association would not be held hostage by a neighbor and would pursue an independent connection immediately, and she asked how many days it would take. Naomi told her the honest answer, which is that the design alone would take 8 to 10 weeks, permitting 3 to 6 months if nothing went wrong, and construction after that with a realistic in-service date somewhere between 14 and 20 months out. Camille said that was unacceptable and asked whether an expedited option existed. Naomi said emergency generation could be rented for the clubhouse and the gates, that portable generation for 222 homes was not a thing that exists, and that no utility in the country would energize an unbuilt feeder because a board found the schedule inconvenient. And Camille, according to 2 people who were there, said the sentence that ended her presidency, though it took another 3 weeks to finish dying. She said Mr. Vance is bluffing. She said it the way a person says something they have decided to believe because the alternative requires admitting a mistake in front of a treasurer. She told the board I was a small operator with a truck and a shop, that I could not afford litigation, that I had no interest in walking away from a monthly check, and that when the deadline got close I would take whatever was put in front of me. Nobody in that room had read the contract. That is the thing I still find remarkable. 9 people were making decisions about a facility none of them had ever looked up. Naomi called me that night from her car, and she is not a dramatic person, so the pause before she spoke told me more than the words did. She said she had done this job for 19 years and had explained hard timelines to a lot of angry people, and that she had never once had someone treat a switching consequence as a negotiating position. Then she said she was going to be direct with me because I deserved to know what I was standing in the middle of. Darius, she said, I do not think she understands what is going to happen when that date comes. Camille's response to the notice was not legal, it was editorial. 4 days later, she sent a message to every household in Briar Glen under the subject line, "Protecting our community from external pressure," and I have read it enough times to recite the structure. It said an adjacent landowner was attempting to extort the association over utility access. It said the board was exploring all legal remedies against what it called an opportunistic claim. It said residents might experience temporary service disruptions caused by this individual's actions. It urged everyone to direct concerns to the association office rather than engaging the neighbor directly, which is a sentence designed to make a man sound dangerous without saying so. What it did not say was that the service agreement had expired in January. It did not say the association had let 3 invoices go unpaid. It did not say 2 renewal proposals had been delivered and ignored. It did not say the board had claimed ownership of equipment it had never owned, or that contractors had been dispatched with a bolt cutter, or that a deputy had told the president she was the trespasser. It did not say that the alternative she was calling a remedy carried a price tag she already had in writing. 222 households read that message. I know at least a dozen of them believed every word because for about 10 days people slowed down at my gate to look at me. Judith Carver came to my door on a Saturday morning with a folder under her arm and the expression of someone who has already decided to be uncomfortable. She said she was not there to take sides, that she had been in the neighborhood 21 years, and that she wanted to hear the other half from a person instead of from a message. I did not argue with her, and I did not tell her what to think. I put on coffee, and I laid the documents out on my kitchen table in chronological order, the way my father taught me to lay out test results, and I let her read at her own speed while I sat across from her and said nothing at all. Then she said something I had not expected, and it changed the shape of everything that came after. She said she recognized the original agreement, not the contents, the document itself, the header and the exhibit numbering, because it was in the developer turnover binder, the same binder every board member gets a digital copy of on the day they take a seat. She said it was in Section 9, filed under Utility and Infrastructure Agreements, and that she had scrolled past it herself years ago without reading it. Which meant, she said slowly, working it out as she said it, that Camille had a copy of this on the day she was sworn in. I let her arrive at the rest of it herself, because a conclusion a person reaches alone is a conclusion that holds. If the agreement was in the turnover binder, then the ownership clause was in the turnover binder. If the ownership clause was there, then the claim that the transformer belonged to Briar Glen was not a misunderstanding. It was a position somebody chose in writing on association letterhead, with a case number, after having access to the document that disproved it. Judith asked me the question directly, and her voice had gone thin. "So why does she keep telling us the association owns it?" I told her the truth. That was exactly what I wanted to know. The termination date fell on a Thursday in the first week of April, and I want you to understand how ordinary that day was, because that is the part nobody expects. I worked. I drove out to a cold storage warehouse in the morning to replace a failed contactor, ate lunch in the truck, came home at 4, paperwork at the kitchen table, and answered 2 emails about a job the following week. I did not go out to the pad. I did not touch a switch, a handle, a breaker, or a relay. I did not stand at the fence and watch the clock. My hands were on a keyboard and then on a coffee pot, and there is a camera file that shows exactly that, which Grant made sure I preserved. At 6:17 in the evening, I was pouring coffee at the counter with the window open because the day had turned warm. My own lights stayed on because my house and shop have always been fed from a separate service off the county road, a detail my father insisted on decades ago for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this and that I have thanked him for many times since. I heard the pad hum change pitch, a sound I have known since childhood, the way you know a family member's cough. Then I looked up through the trees. Briar Glen went dark in stages over maybe 4 seconds, and it was the most orderly thing I have ever watched. The clubhouse windows went black. The limestone monument sign at the western entry, uplit in soft white every night for a year, simply stopped existing. The entry gates cycled once and fell back on their battery units, and the little red standby lamps came up on both pillars. Behind the tree line, 222 houses lost their glow at once, and what was left was a kind of grainy blue nothing with headlights moving through it. At 6:54, the white SUV came up my access road so fast it threw gravel into the fence. Camille got out with her phone still lit in her hand and no sunglasses and no clipboard and no board members, and she was at my gate before the door had finished closing. She did not use my name. She said, "Turn it back on." I stayed on my side of the gate with my hands where she could see them, and I told her the truth. I did not turn it off. She said I knew what she meant. I said no, that I actually needed her to say precisely what she meant, out loud in her own words. She stared at me, and I could see her running the sentence in her head and finding out that every version of it was a problem. Restore power to the association, she finally said. Restore the association's power. So I asked her the only question the moment required, and I asked it quietly, because there was no reason to be loud. Whose transformer exactly was she asking me to restore? Camille Whitmore, who had stood in that same spot in April and told me the future of 222 families would not depend on a man living behind this gate, opened her mouth and did not have one word to put in it. Behind her, out past the trees, 222 dark houses were waiting on an answer she had spent a year making impossible to give. Naomi arrived 20 minutes later with a utility truck and a supervisor, and by then 8 or 9 residents had walked up the road in the dark with flashlights, drawn by the SUV and the noise. Camille turned to Naomi with visible relief, as though the professionals had finally shown up to correct the misunderstanding, and instructed her to restore service. Naomi, who had spent 19 years being calm at people, explained at once. The utility could not transmit through privately owned equipment when the infrastructure agreement had terminated. There was no authority to do it, no mechanism, and no engineer who would sign the order. The path was not broken. The path was closed. Camille said, loudly, that the transformer belonged to Briar Glen. Naomi looked down at the folder on her hood, and she took her time, and she turned pages that everyone standing there could see. Then she looked up at Camille and said, "No, ma'am, it never belonged to Briar Glen, and there is nothing in our records that has ever said otherwise." 9 or 10 residents heard that sentence in the dark with their flashlights pointed at the ground, and I watched the story Camille had been telling since March come apart, in real time, in front of the exact people she had told it to. So I said the one thing I had been carrying since April, and I said it evenly, without heat, because heat would have ruined it. I said I had been under the impression that a man like me could not be expected to understand how a homeowners association operates. Nobody laughed, nobody cheered. A woman near the back made a small sound. Camille stood in the beefum of somebody flat with 222 dark houses behind her, and she did not say another word to me that night. She got into the SUV and drove back into her neighborhood, and her headlights were the only moving light in it. The emergency meeting was called for the following Monday evening at the clubhouse, which by then had a rented generator humming outside it and extension cords taped across the floor. I had not planned to attend. Grant told me to come, and he told me why, in his slow way. He said the neighborhood was going to hear a story that night regardless, and that the only question was whether the documents would be in the room while it was told. So I put on a clean shirt, and I sat in the 3rd row from the back, and the clubhouse was so full that people stood along both walls and out into the hallway. Grant stood up, introduced himself as counsel for Vance Electrical Infrastructure, asked the chair for 5 minutes, and was granted them by a show of hands that was not close. He did not make a speech. He put documents on the projector one at a time and read the dates. The recorded deed, the parcel map, the 1988 survey, the original agreement with the ownership clause enlarged so the back wall could read it, both renewals, the expiration date in January, the October and November renewal proposals with the fee schedule visible, 3 unpaid invoices, the infrastructure control notice, the termination letter, the certified mail receipt with a signature on it that belonged to the association office. Judith Carver asked for the floor next, and she was shaking, and she did it anyway. She said she had requested the board's message archive under the association's own document access, and that she had received it Friday, and she read 2 items aloud. The first was an internal message Camille had sent to 2 board members in November, and the line she read was this: "Once Vance realizes he has no leverage, he will sign whatever we put in front of him." Judith read it twice because the first time the room reacted over the end of it. The second was worse and quieter. It was a February message that included a consultant's rough order of magnitude estimate for an independent feeder, and the number in it ran into the millions. And Camille's reply to that estimate said the association's position was to secure continued use at no cost through legal pressure rather than fund an alternative. Judith set the pages down and said what everybody in that room had already assembled. Camille had known the transformer was not theirs, had known the alternative was ruinously expensive, and had decided the cheapest path was to convince one man he had no standing to say no. That was the strategy, not community safety, not property values. About who I was and how hard I would be to push aside. The treasurer, a soft-spoken man named Allen who had said almost nothing all evening, asked the only question left, and he asked it looking straight at her. "Camille," he said, "did you know the transformer did not belong to this association from the beginning?" 200 people waited. The generator hummed. Camille Whitmore looked at the table in front of her, and she did not answer, and the not answering went on so long that it became the answer, and everyone in the room heard it. I told them I had never asked for an unreasonable number, and then I told them what I had actually asked for, because none of them had ever been shown it. Before any of this, in October, I had delivered a proposal for a 10-year agreement. The maintenance fee in it was within 9% of what the association had already been paying for 8 years, adjusted for the cost of oil testing and infrared inspection that had gone up on my side. It included shared maintenance costs on a defined schedule, so the association was not paying for my pump houses. It included controlled access for inspection with 48 hours notice, so their engineers could see the equipment anytime they had a reason to. It included a capacity study at my expense if they ever wanted to add load. Then I asked Grant to put the proposal on the projector, and I stood there while the whole room read it. I watched people do the arithmetic. The 10-year total on my agreement was a fraction of 1% of the consultant's feeder estimate that Judith had just read out loud. A woman 2 rows ahead of me puts her hand on her forehead. Somebody in the back said the number out loud in a voice that carried. I did not say anything else about it because the page was better at making my argument than I was. A man standing along the side wall, mid-30s, holding a toddler's jacket in one hand because he had come straight from home, asked the question the whole evening had been walking toward. He asked, "Then why are we sitting in the dark?" He was not asking me, and he was not shouting. He was asking the front of the room. I did not answer him. I looked at Camille Whitmore, and I let the silence do the last of the work, and 200 people followed my eyes, and then nobody needed a single additional sentence from anybody. The board went into executive session for 40 minutes and came back out and did it in public, which I respected. The motions came one after another. Camille Whitmore was suspended from the office of president effective immediately. Her contracting authority and her signature authority on association accounts were revoked. She was directed to surrender all association records, devices, and files in her possession within 72 hours. A motion to refer the November and February messages and the infrastructure control notice to independent counsel for review of potential breach of fiduciary duty passed with 1 abstention. She sat through all of it very straight, and she did not speak, and when it was finished she gathered her folder and left by the side door. An interim infrastructure committee was formed that night, 3 members, and Judith Carver was named to negotiate directly with me because she was the only person on that board who had actually read the file. We met the next morning at my kitchen table, the same table, and she came with a legal pad and an apology I told her she did not owe me. And here is where I want to be honest about the temptation, because it was real. I had a neighborhood of 222 homes in the dark, a board with no legal position, and a documented record of bad faith. I could have named a number 4 times higher, and they would have paid it that week, gratefully. I did not do that, and not because I am a saint. I did it because my father put that bank on that pad to run water and machines, and eventually houses, and because a man who exploits an emergency has agreed that emergencies are for exploiting. So I asked for 5 things: payment of the 3 outstanding invoices at the original contract rate, no penalty, no interest; reimbursement of my documented legal costs, which Grant itemized and which came to less than the association had spent on limestone; execution of the October proposal unchanged at the same fee; a written access protocol signed stating clearly that no person enters my property without authorization, and 1 more. The 5th item was the one I would not move on, and Judith understood it before I finished explaining. The association was to send a written correction to every household on association letterhead stating the facts: that the transformer bank and the land beneath it are privately owned by Vance Electrical Infrastructure, that the association's use had been contractual and had lapsed, that the association had received and had not acted on a renewal proposal in October, that no extortion of any kind had occurred, and that the characterization circulated in March was inaccurate. Not an apology. I did not ask for an apology, just the facts sent to the same list. They energized in the late afternoon, and I did not watch from the pad. I made coffee, which is apparently what I do at the important moments of my life, and I took the cup out to my porch and sat on the top step with my elbows on my knees. The tanks behind me settled into their hum. Then, through the tree line, it came back the way it had gone, in a run along the main loop, the near streetlights first, and then the far ones, the limestone monument at the west entry glowing up out of nothing, the clubhouse windows filling in 1 bank at a time. Judith called me about 20 minutes later. She said 2 words, "Power's back," and I could hear a television going somewhere behind her. I looked out at the pad, at the yellow switch handles my father painted the summer I turned 18, and I told her the truth as plainly as I know how to say it. It was never the problem. The transformer had done its job perfectly every day for 14 years and had never once failed anybody. Judith went quiet, and then she said she understood, and I believed her. The problem was never the machine. The problem was a person who believed that authority in a small place entitled her to decide what another person could possibly own, and then went looking for a man who would be easy to be wrong about. Camille Whitmore came to my gate one more time, about 5 weeks later on a Saturday morning in the middle of May. She came alone in a car I had never seen, a gray sedan, not the SUV, no clipboard, no board members, no surveyor. She was in jeans and a plain shirt, and she stood at my gate for a moment before she called out, and I came down from the porch with a coffee cup in my hand and stopped on my side. And then she said my name, Mr. Vance, not that man, not the property owner, not the man from the old property, which is what she had called me to at least 4 different people over the course of a year. Mr. Vance, she said, thank you for making the time. I had been called a great many things by that woman in that spot, and hearing 2 syllables of ordinary courtesy was stranger than any of them. She tried to explain herself, and I let her, because she had let me stand there once and I understood the arithmetic of that. She said she had been elected to protect the value of people's homes, that she had inherited a mess, that she had been under pressure from members who wanted results fast, and that she had believed she was acting in the community's interest. She said the legal position had been given to her by a consultant. She said she had made mistakes in how she communicated. It was not quite a defense and not quite an apology, and I think it was the best she had. I told her no. I said it without any anger left in it because the anger had gone somewhere else months earlier. I said she did not misread a contract. She looked at me, at my house, at my truck, at my hands, and she made a decision about what kind of man I was and how much room he was allowed to take up, and then she built a year of association policy on top of that decision. Everything after that was just paperwork trying to catch up to the assumption. Camille did not argue with me. She looked at the gravel, and she said nothing, and the nothing was the most honest thing she had ever offered me. I told her that the next time she looked at a person and let the color of their skin tell her what they owned, or what they knew, or how much respect they had earned, she should remember 222 houses sitting in the dark for 11 days. Not because of me, because of an assumption she was so sure about that she never checked it against a single piece of paper. Camille Whitmore got into her gray sedan and backed down my access road, and she never said another word to me, and I have not spoken to her since. Nothing about my life got bigger after that. The pickup still sits beside the shop with the primer patch on the fender. The field fence along the road is still the same fence because it works and because I have never once cared what it says about my investment. The house did not become a mansion. I still do commercial maintenance work 4 days a week, still climb into hot warehouse ceilings in July, still test oil in the fall and shoot the bank with the thermal camera in the spring the way my father did it. The only thing that actually changed is a small sign bolted to the frame beside my gate. It reads Private Property, Vance Electrical Infrastructure, Authorized Access Only. It costs $31. It is the least interesting object in this entire story, and it says everything the last year was about. She was half right, and I want to be fair about the half she got. I had no power over Briar Glen Estates. I could not vote there. I could not attend a meeting. I could not change a single line of their 31-page architectural standards, and I never wanted to. But I owned the thing Briar Glen needed, and I had owned it the entire time she was writing me letters about the color of my shop. Every notice she mailed traveled past equipment with my name on the deed beneath it. And here is the part I would want anybody to take from this, if they take anything. The strongest answer to somebody who has looked down on you is almost never crushing them. I never raised my voice at that woman. I never touched a switch. I never threatened one family in that neighborhood, and when I finally had them at their weakest, I charged them the same price I had offered before any of it started. I just stopped letting them use something that was never theirs.